Have you ever felt like you don't fit the mold of Western beauty? Has it been hard to keep up with fashion trends because they seem like they change bi-weekly? Now, what if I told you there's a subculture that forged itself to be hailing against materialism and elitism? That would be the Goths. I've grown up on goth rock thanks to my father, and I have identified with the subculture for several years now. Since I began living in Savannah, my connections with the subculture have strengthened. I'm sure you've seen us around. The consistent emphasis on black clothing, hair, makeup, accessories, anything adhering to the vampiric inspirations of goth in the 1980s. But that's not all that it is. Goth is a music-based subculture that was created to break the one-dimensional outlook on the gloominess of life. It has only recently splintered out into various forms of fashion that can be seen over the years. Today, I'll inform you about the foundations of goth subculture and what it has turned into today. First, we'll talk about the origins of goth, British-based music that appeared in the late 70s to the early 80s. Second, we'll talk about the way that it solidified itself as a subculture, with the creation of the London Batcave. And lastly, we'll talk about what goth looks like today, and the different forms of fashion that can be seen over the years. According to the subcultures list, goth really started with the Northampton band Bauhaus's 1979 song Bela Lugosi's Dead, an ode to Lugosi, who played Dracula in the 1930s. The beginning of the 9-minute song starts with these echoey drums and guitar plucks. Before Peter Murphy begins to sing in grouped verses intermissioned by more guitar. Bela Lugosi's dead. Goth rock is defined by danceable percussion, driving bass lines, distorted guitar, dramatic vocals, dark scales, and reverb, as Play-Along Records would put it. It's a genre that split off from the punk rock scene in the 1970s and became its own. This song gave way to bands like The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, and Typo Negative. All bands that would create their own gothic form of music. They follow the same idea regarding bass lines, guitar, and drum fills, but they'd have their own flair. Now that we've discussed the origins of goth rock, let's go through the way that goth even forged itself into a subculture, the Batcave. In July of 1982, London goths decided that they needed a place to dwell together, thus created the Batcave. According to Underground England, once entering through a hollowed-out coffin, goths would find themselves in the club lined with cheap cobwebs and torn trash bags that would finally set the subculture into stone. The term Batcavers was coined as people distinguished themselves from other less prolific clubs by adorning with batwing coffin necklaces. As Far Out magazine puts it, the Batcave aided in the progression of this movement rather than copying a mainstream trend. It forged the identity of goth. It gave a place for people to come together and feel communal. It hosted a range of art house films, dancing, and live music with those same bands that I mentioned earlier. In fact, the most prolific artist that performed the Batcave was Siouxsie Sioux. She's referred to as the godmother of goth, most likely because of her influence at this club. The other element of this club that aided in solidifying goth as a subculture was the fashion. Early goth clothing was not something that you could just find in stores, and what could be found was incredibly expensive. The fashion was a DIY ideology. To be in uniform, someone could make outfits at home with little to no money and be just as successful as someone who had bought theirs. This leads me into my third and final point regarding the Gothic subculture, the fashion and how it has transformed itself over the years. Gothic fashion was born from androgyny. The makeup and clothing was specifically created to break the norms of male and female. Traditional 80s goth fashion tends to be what we think of when it is mentioned, however that's not all that it is. The misconception that goth is all black clothing has been pushed for many years, but actually, throughout the early 2000s, goth was reborn into many different subcategories. Returning to Underground England, it is explained that some of the subcultural mutations are cybergoth, characterized by bright hair, leather, and goggles; costume goth, characterized by romantic long layers, satin corsets, and gloves; and emo, a form of mall goth, characterized by store-bought jeans and band tees. This style is generally looked down upon by traditional goths as a commercialization of goth culture. These are only a few of the countless modifications of Gothic fashion over the recent years. In conclusion, we discussed the foundations of Gothic subculture and what it has turned into today. Firstly, we talked about the origins of Goth, British-based music that appeared in the late 70s to the early 80s. Next, we discussed the way it solidified itself as a subculture with the creation of the London Batcave. And lastly, we spoke about what Goth looks like today, the different forms of fashion over the recent years. So next time you see someone walking down the streets of Savannah, dressed in layers of black, hair done up like crazy, think about saying hi. And remember that Goth is more alive than ever. In the words of Bauhaus, it's undead, undead, undead. Undead.